Dog Works Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
You can support this podcast on patreon.com/First Paw Media. Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site, and you can find all of our episodes on dogworksradio.com. Be sure to check us out over on social media and hit that subscribe button wherever you are listening, because like tonight, we have a special episode. And joining me is my co-host, Toni Reitter, calling in from Kenai, Alaska. Toni, how's it going tonight?
Going really well. It's been an interesting last few days since I talked to you last. So I'm kind of excited to dive in and bring some, hopefully, discussion, at least, if not some clarity, to a very interesting turn of events for one of our premier 1,000-mile races.
Yes, and it is a special report. About the same time we were recording our last episode, the Who Are You, Toni episode, which will air yesterday, actually. We're going to talk about some news that broke that same day about the Yukon Quest. I'm going to let Toni lay it out, and then we'll jump into the discussion.
Okay, so part of this is basically almost like a he said, she said, or a they said, I guess, is a better way to describe it. For those who don't really know how the Yukon Quest works, because the Quest runs in both Alaska and Canada, and they cross that border every year, the Quest has an interesting setup where they have two boards of directors. So you have the Alaska side and you have the Canadian, or the Yukon side, not really the Canadian, but they call themselves the Yukon side. And for the last few years, there's been a lot of drama that has made its way to the forefront, and it's almost kind of taken over the spotlight for the race. They've had several dissolutions of boards where they've had to rebuild it from the ground up. Then we had COVID, and there were a lot of logistics that had to be looked at and taken care of from both sides, because Alaska, of course, had very different ways of dealing with the pandemic than the Yukon in Canada did. So that has led to a number of different races that they've put on the last couple of years. And from what I've gathered from the different articles, because there's not one set story of what has happened, and each media article that you read has almost a completely different spin on it, as more of the different board members speak out on what happened. But essentially what happened earlier, or I should say late in April, was the boards got together to start discussing the 2023 Yukon Quest race. And in that discussion, the Yukon side proposed a huge amount of new regulations as far as rest. Now, according to the Alaska side, they wanted to go from 50 hours of mandatory rest on the 1,000-mile race to 120 hours for the 1,000-mile race. Now, according to a post that Susan Rogan, the president of the Yukon Quest board, or the Yukon side of the board, are we confused yet? Because I'm starting to feel confused myself. She says that the proposed extra 70 hours of rest time was not exclusively for the 1,000-mile race, but that also included the rest for the other shorter distance races that they wanted to run at the same time. Going back to the Alaska board said no, they wanted to run it just like they ran the 2020 race, which was the last time I believe the Quest ran a quote-unquote normal scheduled race, 1,000-mile race with all the normal, what we're used to for the Quest. They say that the other big proposal was the Yukon side was willing to put in the trail for the Yukon side and man checkpoints, but that they were not going to help in any way financing the race, so that all of the financial aspect of the race would have to go with the Alaska side, and Alaska didn't like that either. So they were at an impasse, and they had to call a special second session, which happened a couple days later. It didn't sound like anything was really happening where there was a lot of compromise, again, according to the Alaska side. And so Alaska said, you know what, we're going to back off. Now, according to the Yukon side, again, are we getting confused? Because I am definitely hoping that I have figured this out, because it is confusing reading all the different accounts. According to the Yukon side, they did not know that Alaska had decided to just basically dissolve the partnership and go their own way until the press release hit on, was it Monday or Tuesday? It all blurs together, but a press release came out from the Alaska board saying that they were no longer partnering with the Yukon side, that they were going to run their own 1,000-mile race, running the Alaska portion of the Yukon Quest Trail. And I guess doing a loop, I haven't actually seen what their proposal is, but Fairbanks is involved in all of that. So, the Yukon side says they found out when the Fairbanks News Miner, which is the Fairbanks major newspaper up there, they contacted the Yukon board looking for comments, and that's how they found out about the press release. So it's convoluted. There's a lot of pieces to it. Sebastian Schnula, who's part of the Yukon board, said that he called over to the Alaska board and said, you know, is this something that if we were to just get new board members on the Yukon side, that we could maybe come to an agreement? He says that the Alaska board said, absolutely not, don't even bother trying. And then I've talked with other mushers that, are kind of off the record. They don't really, I think, want to get involved publicly. But, they said that they saw the writing on the wall about 2 years ago when this all started to, there were just little things that both boards weren't getting along, and it just kept snowballing. And COVID really put that wrench and gave the Yukon board especially, again, this is from other mushers that have run the Quest, that have their own opinions. I don't know. I don't really have a dog in this fight. Yukon Quest is not really the race that I eat, sleep, breathe. So I'm not picking sides. I don't know who to believe. This is kind of like the mushing version of the depth versus herd court case that everybody's watching, and I have no clue what's going on there either. But basically, this is something that the Yukon Quest on the Yukon side has been pushing for a couple of years to slow the Yukon Quest down and almost turn it into a stage stop race like we see down in the States. And that's a lot of just the personal views of certain members of the board really pushing for how they think mushing races should be run, which every board is going to do. But the Alaska side, their big argument is that there are policies and procedures in place for how these rules and changes to the rules and changes to the regulations should happen. And they accuse the Yukon board of wanting to bypass the rules committee to just go ahead and decide this now at a board meeting. The Yukon side of the Yukon board, they say that they don't want to go through the rules committee because there's no Yukon side board members on the rules committee, but there are at least 2 members of the Alaska board on the rules committee, so they don't think they'd get a fair shot at getting their things passed. So it just basically sounds like, to me, a lot of egos trying to come up with their own version of a race, and so nobody's really wanting to compromise. And I think this is just a really good example of why 2 boards are not better than one, because I don't even know how you run an organization with 2 governing bodies trying to come together. It just seems horribly. I feel like this was just brewing and has been brewing probably longer than anybody wants to admit. So I don't even know where to begin as far as discussing this. It's just been a huge whirlwind all week.
Well, there is a lot to unpack there. 10 minutes, 54 seconds to unpack.
Oh my God.
So that is a lot of information, and I'll do my best to sort of break it down from my understanding. And as you mentioned, it is a very unique race compared to other distance races, not only in this country, but in other countries. When we think about the Alpen Trail in France and the Norway Trail in Norway and the Finnmark up in that Scandinavian area as well, because it does have 2 sort of governing bodies, 2 countries, and like you said, a heck of a lot of egos. Just a quick backtrack, the Yukon Quest started in the 80s, and it's designed as more of a rugged type race compared to Iditarod, more of a kind of a adventure type race compared to the commercial acclaim that Iditarod definitely holds on to. But in the last 5 or 10 years or so, it's really, really dropped off in terms of participation. I believe in 2020 they only had 15 entries, and that's a very small number. I mean, you have local sprint races that have more participants than that, and that's sort of a changing of the times with dog mushing. I know Iditarod has been struggling with that as well, but they still have every year 50 or 60 or so odd mushers in that, so 4 times the field of the Quest. And as you mentioned, there's been a heck of a lot of fundraising problems, sponsorship problems, logistical problems with COVID. I know that the Canadian border was closed a heck of a lot longer than just about everywhere else in the world, and that sort of threw a wrench into it. But like you said, Toni, this sort of has been brewing over the last few years, and I don't know if there is a solution. I don't know if there needs to be a solution. I don't know if there needs to be 2 boards other than, an ego grab, as you mentioned, somebody that wants their hand in the pot. And that's typical in dog mushing. People want to have the power, and that could be not only with dog mushing, but just about any organized activity, whether it's HOAs with homeowners or organized sports or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or any community type organization. Everybody wants their hand in the cookie jar. But what's interesting is both sides are really unwilling to budge on what they said, what happened. And I read a lot of the reports that you did, and I don't think I've nearly read as many as you, but I read one this afternoon. You had mentioned Susan Rogan, who is, I think you said, the president or the chairman of the Yukon board. And they said that was blatantly incorrect, that 120 hours rest. It was more based on sort of the old school mushing standard of equal run, equal rest, 6 on, 6 off. And then they did some math and came up with something like 80% rest or run compared to rest. And they came up with 117 hours or something like that. And the Yukon Quest is a little bit different because it has a really long rest period in Dawson, unlike the Iditarod, which has a 24-hour mandatory rest. In the Yukon, everybody stops at the halfway point for 36 hours. And I know that Susan argued that, dogs don't necessarily need more than 12 hours rest. By the time that's over, they're ready to get back up and rocking and rolling. So that 36 hour was was for other reasons, and we could definitely argue what those reasons are, whether it's boon to the economy of Dawson or, musher inebriation or whatever is happening during that time. It is definitely a party atmosphere for sure. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I see this sort of working out in the long run, like so many of these things do. And I was thinking about other sports. You hear about, strikes in baseball or in football or in hockey or whatever. We're never going to cross the picket line type thing, and they're just ruffling feathers. And then, of course, before you know it, they're back on the field and playing. I don't know if that's what's going to happen here, but I think that there's going to be some cooperation at some point because everybody wants their part in this. And I don't know if we'll ever see the Quest like we saw it before, but I think that there will be a reconsideration. So that's my point on it. So I guess to start a little bit of the discussion, what questions do you have? And maybe we can just do some proposing type questions because neither of us have the answers, but at least we can, start a discussion on our end, and that can definitely contribute over on social media.
Yeah. So, my big question is how has it taken this long for two boards to finally just not be able to work out? Because I don't actually know the full history of the Quest. I don't know when two boards were formed or if that was from the start. We've all heard the version that Hugh Neff liked to share all the time about his now ex-wife grandfather who helped start the race.
Yes.
And it just sounds like most other mid-distance and long-distance races that started in Alaska around the same time. It was just in a bar and, hey, it was just another excuse to go out with your dogs and have fun with your friends, and beer was involved. And, that's the same story that we have down here on the Kenai with the Tustamina 200. Osmar wanted to just go out into the hills with a bunch of beer and race dogs. And I mean, that's an oversimplification, but that's kind of how the culture was in the 70s and 80s when they were getting most of these races off the ground. And so I just kind of wonder, when did, and this isn't just a Yukon Quest problem. We saw this happen just 5 years ago with the Iditarod when that board had to be completely retooled. Their policies and procedures for board membership and whatnot, that all had to change in order to, they hoped, preserve the race and to protect the race from itself, because egos had done enough damage. They felt that they needed to completely retool. We saw that happen, I think, around the same time with the Alaska side of the Yukon Quest. I seem to recall some big hiccups there, and now we're having it where basically we're almost looking at a biblical epic of, slice the baby in half, give half to Alaska, give half to the Yukon, and there's really no governing body of mushing to just, tell them all to put on their big boy and big girl panties and get over it and start working together. So it's really going to be up to, I think, the mushers and the fans. But I don't even know where you start with something like this. I would like to hope, like you said, that we could possibly see this as just grandstanding, and by February we're talking about the Quest again. But I don't know. I mean, it was such a unique race that I hate to see it go through this.
Yeah, I agree. And like you had mentioned, so many races get started, as you said, in a bar, on a napkin, whatever. We just heard today, before we went on air, another long distance race that somebody's proposing up near Nome, starting in Nome, heading up to Kotzebue and back. I know that's been talked about before, but something is in the works, very similar to what you just mentioned. Hey, let's just sit around a little bit, talk about it, and before you know it, we're racing. And that occurs quite often. I mean, I could think of a handful of races that have started just that way. My main question is, is this sort of the future of the sport? Because, with economics and sponsors and all of that, I think that this is more money than it is
Mm,
grandstanding, because there's just such a lack of sponsors. There's such a lack of
right.
interest. It takes a heck of a lot to do 1,000-mile race, and very few teams have the capability of doing both 1,000-mile races. I know that has been done several times. I know Brent Sass has done it several times. I know Hugh Neff has done it a few times. I know, of course, Lance Mackey has done it a few times, including winning them both in the same year as well. So
Mhm.
it's definitely possible to do it, but usually a long distance team will pick one or the other, and often they're picking them by simple economics. If they have the ability to do very well in one race, and we're talking, of course, the elite professional mushers that have the ability to win one of these races, most often they're going to go with a more stable race, and stability meaning better purse, better logistics, etc. So it's tough when you have both races happening literally just a couple of weeks apart.
Definitely, yeah. And you hear, a lot of it is, teams wanting to preserve um, that Iditarod team, because the Iditarod is maybe not necessarily the bigger purse as far as winnings, but certainly that's what sponsors are looking for. Their individual sponsors aren't necessarily as excited about the Quest as the Iditarod. The Iditarod is an international, well-known name. Whether or not it's liked, it's a well-known name. And so if you show that you're sponsoring, I have an Iditarod musher, that goes much longer way than when you're saying, oh yeah, I sponsor a Yukon Quest musher. Now, it might mean something to, it means something. It means a lot to those of us who follow mushing and follow it religiously or semi-religiously. But there's a lot of people out there that even when I'm tweeting, and there are people that are following mushing and musher Twitter, they're like, oh, what's the Quest? And I'm like, how do you not know what the Quest is? I talk about it almost as much as Iditarod. So there's just that oh, I can't think of the word now, but there's just that familiarity with Iditarod. And so I think that's why you see, Ali Zirkle, she used to run the 300 with kind of the puppy team. Alan Moore would run the A team in the Quest, and then he would run the puppy team in Iditarod. She would run the main team in the Iditarod with just a few switch outs. You saw Lance Mackey win with the same team, but that's a rarity. I mean, there are more Iditarod champions that won the Quest than vice versa. So, they're both their own beasts, and I think there's this, both races like to say we're the toughest, we're the last great race, we're the toughest race, and that's that's all well and good. It really stirs the imagination, but they're both so different that I think it is hard for any team, whether it's a professional team, a recreational team, we're just here to have fun team, to be able to come up with the logistics of running two very different races and being prepared for both so quickly. It's not surprising that Iditarod can keep up with 50 to 60 mushers a year and the Yukon Quest peter out, because again, you're more familiar with the Iditarod. These mushers, even the ones with the Yukon Quest bios, they all say, I got into mushing because I wanted to run the Iditarod, or I watched the Iditarod and that was so cool, I wanted to do that. And then they've branched off into other things. You very rarely have the Brent Sasses who are like, oh, I came up, I started mushing so that I could run and win the Yukon Quest. It's normally the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. And I definitely want to hear the fans' perspective. I know that's your pulse right there. But one question to you, and then, of course, I'll answer the same. And I'll go first. Do you like the format of the proposed race that the Canadian side proposed with all the rest? I kind of like it. I think it is more of that stage race. I think it's a little bit better for the fans. I think it may be better for the dogs to have that much race, especially if they go like they do the stage stop down in Wyoming where they're going. And I know that that's a sprint race compared, but they go from uh, town to town. At least down there, they're towns, so they're not villages like they are up here. And then they run 40, 50, 60 kilometers or miles or whatever. Then they start all over again tomorrow. I like that idea. I think that there needs to be more stage type races. I know that this is a distance race, but I don't necessarily have a problem with all of the rest. Of course, I know that it's not quote unquote tough that way, being that you're going to rest a heck of a lot more than you have in the past. But I kind of like the format. What about you?
I talked with a Yukon Quest musher when this all started, and I just could not figure out what I thought about it, other than I don't like change necessarily. So I just naturally was like, no, we don't need to change things up. And they were saying how, they personally did not like the proposed changes, because in what they had read from the Yukon's proposal, it took a lot of choice from the mushers and in how they rest their team, in what their team needs. It wouldn't matter what their team needed as far as rest. If they were running and they rest too soon, sometimes your dogs just don't ever really pick back up from that, versus, if they rest too late, same thing. And that's something that not only you can train for, sure, but then when you have teams that are running different races all season long with those different rules, it kind of makes you choose between being a stage stop team versus a long or mid distance team. I don't know the science behind that, but that was one of the concerns. It also, I know one of the big arguments that people have made is it also is going to increase the time that this race is run. And so a week and a half race is now turning into two and a half. And I think they said it would add 5 days to it, which I can also see that. I mean, it's hard enough to get the volunteers for a week and a half. You're adding in another 5 days. You're going to need to pull in a lot more support that way. And no race this year or in the last 5 years, even before the pandemic, no race was fully staffed with volunteers. It's a very hard commitment, not only from a time-wise perspective, but you're out there in the freezing cold in probably not the best shelter conditions. You're not sleeping much, which is all well and good and fine. I absolutely love volunteering. There's a rush to it. But asking people to give up that much time, especially if that's probably all of their vacation time for the entire year, you're going to have a hard time filling those slots. And these races do not run without volunteers. That's not me as a volunteer of races tooting my own horn. I just know that there's no infrastructure to fill and replace volunteers. And so I think that's where a lot of these races have made big mistakes. Not only have they angered mushers over some of these changes and this drama, but they're angering not only their fan base, but their volunteers that have been here since the beginning. And so I think the volunteers, I think they need to start having a voice when there are these big changes and these big shakeups. Just because, I mean, they're the lifeblood of the race.
And speaking of logistics for volunteers or anybody in the race, it's much different than Iditarod because, Iditarod has the quote-unquote Iditarod Air Force, and they have that machine that just sort of just works its way down the trail, whereas the Quest, there's a heck of a lot of driving just to be able to get from one point to another. I've read many times where they'll say that the handlers of a Quest team are on the road like twice or maybe 3 times more miles than the musher themselves, because they got to drive all the way back and all the way back around. And it's just a nightmare logistically. And I don't know how that would be possible if it was such a longer race to be able to get all those people on all of those spots, unless of course they were, either on one side or the other. I assume like they are now. So, Toni, I know we're running long, but I definitely want to get to the fan side of this. I know that you've been talking to a lot of people on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, etc. What are not necessarily the mushers? I think we know what the mushers are saying, but what are the fans themselves saying about this, and what are their thoughts about moving forward?
Most of the responses are based on which story they read first, whether it was the Alaska board's version or whether it was the Yukon board's version or the version that Susan Rogan was posting on social media. That's really propelled a lot of the fan opinion. So there's a lot of fans picking one side over the other. And then you have the loud kind of in the middle on the fence people like myself just, going, just get it together. I read one comment from someone just before we went on air, and they were like, these are just children who are not getting along, and someone needs to sit them all down and tell them that they are grown-ups and they need to start acting like it. I don't know, necessarily what all needs to happen, and I don't want to presume because I do know a few of the people that are involved, not well, but, I do have respect for people on both sides of the boards. And I know that, it's been a crazy few years. I did tweet out and I think, post on Facebook that I feel like nobody in the mushing community, especially those in charge of races, should be allowed to make decisions in March, April, and the first part of May, because that's when we finally get the sun. And there's actual scientific evidence that too much exposure to the sun too quickly can cause your brain to go a little bit off. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I really want to believe that's what we're seeing. And like you said, in a few months, everything will go back to at least as normal as mushing can be. And I think that's what a lot of fans have been just hoping that, this is all going to pass. This is just everybody being grumpy and they'll come to a solution. But there's factions of fans going, well, this is all the Alaskans' fault. This is all the Canadians' fault. I stand with Canada. I stand with Alaska. It's a little bit silly. It feels like, we're going to end up with riots there at the headquarters, both in Whitehorse and in Fairbanks, which would actually be entertaining. But it's a sad state. I think fans are getting tired of all of these big shakeups and dramatic race issues when really there just doesn't need to be.
Yep, and I think a lot of it has to do with publicity. As they say, all news is news, whether it's good news or bad news. And of course, as we've talked about many times on this show, mushing is definitely becoming a year-long endeavor compared to how it was years ago, especially before social media. As you're talking, Toni, this reminds me, we talk a lot about the NFL. This sort of reminds me of the NFL versus the USFL or the XFL. It's sort of the tougher side, if you will, of this polished machine with the NFL, with the Super Bowl and all of that. And, you have your marquee players and all. Then you have sort of this other faction of they're professionals, they earn money, they fill stadiums, they have sponsors, but it's nothing like the NFL is. And I think that's sort of how it is with the Yukon Quest and the Iditarod. It's sort of like a little brother who's a little scrappy, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So I guess my final question to you, actually I have a final, but my next question is, do you think that the fans are vested in the quest enough for it to matter? I'm talking about as a whole, and the question is, when I say vested, so if we have 100 fans of dog mushing, What do you think the ratio is? I mean, do we have, 80% of those are Iditarod only fans, and then we have, 30% of that is sort of both, Iditarod and Quest, and then you have just a small
Right.
fraction that is only Quest. You have those folks. Like in football, you
Right.
have diehard New York Jets fans, but everybody's a fan
Those
of
poor fans.
yes, everybody's a fan of the Patriots or whoever won the Super Bowl or whatever. So, what do you think about vested interest? Where do you think 100 fans of mushing sit in terms of ratio?
I think you were pretty good with your ratio when you were just trying to explain it. Um, I don't want to say that it's like 50% like both races. I do think the Quest has a smaller fan base, but they are die hard. Like Iditarod fans, I think the majority of Iditarod fans are Iditarod fans only, and they might pick up some of the other races along the way, but that's just because Dallas Seavey's running it or Lance Mackey's running it, a very well-known, popular name. And I don't mean that as a hit to Iditarod fans. I was there for many, many years. Iditarod was the be-all, end-all, and I could care less if I missed another race other than maybe the Tustamina 200 because it was in my backyard.
Yep, and you said, I didn't mean to interrupt. You said that person
okay.
on Facebook or Twitter, wherever you said, they said, well, what is the Quest? And they're a mushing fan, and I'm sure you used the hashtag. So that is kind of telling, isn't it?
Right, it is. And I knew what the Yukon Quest was growing up, but it was never billed as something as big as the Iditarod. It was just, the other race. And Jeff King was winning it, and Jeff King's the most winningest musher, and like, well, that's great, but Martin Boozer just kicked his butt in the Iditarod, so Martin Boozer's better, that sort of thing. And that was kind of the mentality I grew up with, and I think what was, pushed in the media, I think both here in Alaska and probably outside, I don't know that the Yukon Quest gets as reported on, rightly or wrongly, and good or bad, as Iditarod is. Even in Canada, I have a lot of friends in Canada, and they couldn't tell you anything about their big mushing race. So I think that it's just kind of natural. It's kind of like, I think, the Olympics. We're all fans of gymnastics and figure skating every 4 years, but there's a smaller faction that watches gymnastics every year. And every year in figure skating and track, especially. I mean, who watches competitive walking any other time but the Olympics? And it's kind of the same way with mushing. Everybody's a mushing fan during Iditarod, but are they all going to watch the Copper Basin or the Yukon Quest? No. You can look on fantasymushing.com and see just how many more people sign up for Fantasy Iditarod than they do Quest or any of the other races. It's exponentially higher. So I think it is a smaller faction of mushing fans that are into the Quest, but they are bloodthirsty fans. You do not talk to them about their race and suggest that it isn't the be-all, end-all of dog mushing. They are way more passionate than even Iditarod diehard fans. I bristle every time I have to listen to the argument of, how great the race is and everything, but I'm not going to sit there and argue with you for hours about it because, like, I gave the statistic that I always give. There are more Iditarod champions that are Quest champions than vice versa. But even that is like a slap in their face, and they will go after it kind of like a 49er fan versus a Seahawks fan, or, a Patriots or a Brady fan versus anybody who doesn't like Brady. And it's just a normal, I think, sports mentality. But I think there are a lot of Quest fans that they will go down with this ship. That if it was the Iditarod, I think there'd be a lot of people in the lifeboats before just going down with the ship with Iditarod. And that's just the nature of the beast. But I think the Quest fans, and as an Iditarod diehard and just a Quest hanger on, I'll say that the Quest has the more passionate fans. And so I think that they'll ride it out as long as they can, but I think they are going to choose sides, whether it's the Yukon side and they start going with the Yukon 550, or if they go with the Alaska side and their version of the Yukon Quest 1000.
I am a huge curling fan during the Olympics, and I think a lot of people are. And like you said, you see a lot of passion that comes out in it. And I think, like you said earlier, I think there's a lot of nationalism here. I think that there's a lot of, this is my baby type race compared to, Big Brother and that sort of thing. So we'll see how it plays out, which leads into my final question to you, Toni. And you sort of just answered it just a second ago. Is what is your thought that's going to happen here in 2023 as we stand here on May 5th? What are your thoughts of the Quest? Is it going to run? Is it going to be 2 races in one? Is it going to be no race at all? What are your thoughts here at the 1st of May?
I really hate saying it, but I think 2020 is the last time we've seen the Yukon Quest run the 1,000-mile race as we've seen it run in the years that it's been running. I think we're going to see something along the lines of what we saw this last year, where you have the Yukon Quest happening in the Alaska section with its own little race, and then maybe a week later, you're going to have the Canadian side do their version of the Yukon Quest. What that looks like mileage-wise or setup, I don't know. I would hope at least they didn't try to pick the same date so that they had to battle it out and force the mushers to choose one or the other. The mushers are very passionate. Those that run the Quest every year, they're very passionate about this race. They're as passionate about the Yukon Quest as the Mackeys, the Seavies, and the Reddingtons are about the Iditarod. This is their baby. This is their race. This is what they eat, sleep, and breathe. Brent Sass, loves that race, and he was one of the few that went ahead and ran both the Alaska side and the Canadian side and then headed for the Iditarod, which I think was just insane. Even though those 2 other races were shorter, that's still a lot of logistics, a lot of time, a lot of preparation, and he managed to, I think, win all 3. So that's a huge accomplishment, and I think that that's what we'll see in the near future. I would hope that they could bring back the international 1,000-mile race, cross over that border, and it be a joint effort again. I just don't see it with the boards as they stand now. I don't see them coming together. And I don't know if that means that everybody needs to just, bow out and new people come in and revitalize it, or if, feelings just need to, everybody needs to lick their wounds and in a couple of years they come back, shake hands and try again. I don't know, but I think we've seen the last of the Yukon Quest as we know it.
I agree with you. I think this coming year, we're going to see those 2 sides that we saw last year. We'll see the Alaskan side and the Yukon side. And for folks that may not know, the Yukon Quest was named after the Yukon River, not necessarily the Yukon, meaning the province of Canada. So it was named after the river because, of course, they run along the river for quite a ways of it. So I believe that's where they've gotten their name from it. And as we said at the top of the show, I believe it was formed by a group of people in Alaska. So it started on that Alaska side, then they came together. Right. What I think will happen, and I think you mentioned this earlier, I think that there will be a shakeup like there was in Iditarod, where they will, totally revamp the whole thing like they did with their board and bring in a high-power CEO, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, like they did with Rob Urbach. I think that he brought in a new flavor to Iditarod, and I know a lot of people agree and disagree with what he does, but he definitely brought it into a different light than it was, because sort of that old guard of Iditarod was sort of pushed out, if you will, because of some instances back then. So I think that's what we'll see happening, whether it's 2 boards or not. I think that we'll see a more business-oriented type race than what we see now. Sort of this, fly by the seat of their pants, sort of two factions kind of going together and hoping that it comes to an agreement. I think we'll see definitely a much more organized business-centric type race in the future. So that's what I have. Of course, I will be a fan of it regardless because I'm a mushing fan and I love talking about it and contemplating about it, and we'll see where it goes. So, Toni, anything else before we go?
When you were talking about, them getting a high-powered CEO like Rob Urbach, the first thing I started thinking about was what would they call their Bitcoin? And I'm thinking the Yukon Quest. So that was just my little pun for the evening. If nothing else, this just gives us at least one more race to cover next year to follow along, to lose sleep over. So I think fans, ultimately, we're the winners, as long as, it's not like two people racing one race and two people on another race. I just hope for the best. This sport, we always worry about the outside influences that are going to attack the sport and maybe take it down. But really, if that's our main concern, we really need to start looking internally, because the fans and these boards, they're doing more damage to mushing than any outside campaign could ever possibly do right now. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. So we need to come back together. We need to circle the wagons, not to protect, and keep everybody out, but we need to circle the wagon, sing Kumbaya, and get back to just loving the sport.
Well, my last thought of this, and I'm sure it will ruffle a feather or two, I don't see a problem with a merger with Iditarod buying out or taking over the Yukon Quest.
Man.
And I know
those are fighting words.
Those are, but if you think about it, it happens in other sports all the time, where the bigger sport or the bigger owner's pockets, if you will buy out the little guy and become a conglomeration, if you will. Not a bad portfolio on Iditarod's part if they did do that. They would hold all the keys to the kingdom, if you will, if they did that. So we'll see if that's a possibility. I don't know how deep of pockets Iditarod has, but hey, like you said, with this Iditacoin or the Ucoin that you mentioned, maybe they have deeper pockets than we think.
I take it back.
But it's not necessarily a bad business model, I don't think,
No.
of having a big time organization run it, and I don't know if that's Iditarod or somebody else, but just something to think about. So with that, this is our special report on the Yukon Quest. If you missed this one, it was probably because you were not subscribed to the show. And if you're listening, of course, I'm talking to the air, but make sure you hit that subscribe button. Tell your friends and family about our show. We will be on every couple of weeks. We just have one dropping just the other day where I interviewed Toni and we get to know her a little bit better. We talk a lot about things other than mushing, and I think that will be a very interesting show. So go back to your feed and listen to that one. Otherwise, we'll be back on in a couple of weeks unless we have some more breaking news, whether it be with the Yukon Quest or this new race that has been developing in the last day or so, or some interesting court news that Toni and I talked about before we went on the air that we're not going to let the cat out of the bag just yet. So on behalf of that and my co-host, we will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio.